He texted me at 9:47 that night. "Just finishing a report, honey, home in an hour." And I almost believed him the way I had believed him for 11 years. But then my phone buzzed with the little blue dot from the family locator app we had turned on years ago after his father's stroke. And the dot was not blinking over his office tower downtown. It was sitting still and small and wrong in the darkest corner of Bell Creek Cemetery, the private burial ground that belonged to my family, the Calloways, the place where my father had been lowered into the ground only 11 weeks earlier. I remember standing in my kitchen in my socks, staring at that little blue dot like it was a lie trying to disguise itself as a fact. And I remember the exact second my stomach dropped, because there was nothing at Bell Creek Cemetery that had anything to do with quarterly reports. There was nothing there that belonged to Weston at all, except a headstone with my father's name on it and 11 acres of gravel road that only our family and the groundskeeper ever drove down. I grabbed my keys off the hook by the door. I did not change out of my sweatpants. I did not stop to think about what I would say. I just drove. And the whole way there my hands were shaking so hard on the steering wheel that I had to grip it at 10 and 2 like a teenager taking her driving test. Because some small, stubborn, hopeful part of me was still trying to build an innocent explanation. Maybe he was meeting a groundskeeper about repairs. Maybe there had been vandalism. Maybe. And every single maybe collapsed the second I turned my headlights down that gravel road and saw his black pickup truck parked crooked at the edge of the tree line with no lights on at all, hidden like something that did not want to be found. I cut my own headlights before I reached the gate, some instinct older than thought telling me not to announce myself, and I coasted the last 100 yards in the dark with my heart slamming against my ribs. And when I finally stopped the car and stepped out into the cold Georgia night, I could hear it before I could see it. A rhythmic, scraping, metallic sound, a shovel biting into dirt, over and over, steady as a heartbeat. I walked toward the sound with my phone flashlight off, guided only by the thin silver wash of a half-moon, past my grandmother's headstone, past the little marble angel that marked my baby brother who had lived 4 days in 1987, until I came around the old oak tree and saw him, my husband, jacket off, sleeves rolled up, standing in a hole nearly to his knees at the foot of my father's grave, digging. For one full second I could not make my mouth work. I just stood there in the cold with dead leaves under my socks because I had not even had the sense to put on real shoes. And I watched the man I had married dig into my father's grave like it was the most natural thing in the world. And then I turned my phone flashlight on and pointed it directly at his face. And I said the only 2 words that came to me, "Weston, stop." He froze like a man shot, the shovel still buried in the dirt, his eyes wide and white in the flashlight beam. And for a moment neither of us said anything, the only sound the wind moving through the pines and my own breath coming too fast. And then he did the thing that told me everything I needed to know before he said a single word. He smiled, that easy, practiced, boardroom smile he used on nervous investors, and he said, "Odessa, baby, I can explain." That was the moment I understood that the man standing in my father's grave at 11 o'clock at night was not confused or ashamed. He was calculating, already running the math on how to spin this, and something in me that had been bending for 11 years finally, quietly, permanently snapped straight. My name is Odessa Calloway, though for 11 years I had gone by Odessa Prout, and before that night in the cemetery I would have told you I had a good marriage. Not a perfect one, but a good, steady, comfortable one, built on the kind of quiet trust you stop noticing because it has become the floor you walk on. And I want you to understand that before I tell you what my husband was digging for in my father's grave. Because the betrayal only makes sense once you understand how much I had already given him to betray. I grew up on Calloway land outside Statesboro, Georgia, on 1,100 acres that had belonged to my family since 1904. When my great-great-grandfather Ezra Calloway bought pine timberland from a bankrupt plantation owner for almost nothing because everyone said the soil was too poor to farm. Except Ezra was not planning to farm it. He was planning to grow trees. And by the time my father Franklin Calloway inherited Calloway Land and Timber Company, it had grown into one of the largest privately held timber operations in the southeastern United States, worth, by conservative estimate, somewhere north of $40 million. $, not counting the mineral rights under the eastern parcels that geologists had been quietly interested in for years. My father was not a flashy man. He wore the same brand of work boots for 30 years and drove a truck older than I was. But he understood something that took me a long time to understand too. That land held in a family for 5 generations is not just an asset. It is a responsibility. And he raised me to feel the weight of that responsibility, the way other girls were raised to feel the weight of a family name or a family faith. I met Weston when I was 26, at a land conservation fundraiser in Savannah that I had only agreed to attend because my father asked me to represent the company. And Weston was there representing a regional bank that handled agricultural loans. Tall, easy laugh. The kind of confidence that read as competence before you had any proof of it. And within 6 months, he had become the center of a life I had spent my 20s building carefully around myself. My father liked him at first, or said he did, though I remember one evening on the porch, maybe a year into our engagement, when my father set down his coffee and said, without looking at me, "That boy talks about the company like he already owns half of it." And I laughed it off because that is what you do when you are 27 and in love and do not yet know how to hear a warning even when it is spoken plainly to your face. We married in the fall, in a white tent on the Calloway property with 300 pine trees standing witness. And for the first several years it really was good. Weston left the bank to start his own commercial real estate advisory firm, Prute Capital Advisors, and I threw myself into learning the timber business the way my father had taught me, walking the parcels, learning the harvest cycles, sitting in on negotiations with the State Forestry Commission. And if Weston sometimes introduced himself at parties as though he ran Calloway Land and Timber rather than married into it, I told myself that was just confidence, just the way men like him talked, and I did not correct him, because I told myself correcting him in public would embarrass him, and I loved him, and marriage was not supposed to be a competition. The trouble that ended in a cemetery at midnight, started slowly enough that I can only see the full shape of it now, looking backward, the way you can only see a riptide once you are already caught in it. It started, I think, about 3 years ago, when Prute Capital Advisors lost its 2 largest clients within the same fiscal quarter. A fact I only learned much later because Weston had simply stopped mentioning the firm's numbers at dinner. Had started saying things were in a rebuilding phase whenever I asked, had started taking calls on the back porch with the sliding door closed, small changes, easy to miss individually. The way a single loose thread does not look like a sweater about to unravel. It started, too, around the time my father's health began to fail, first the small strokes he tried to hide, then the diagnosis of vascular dementia that the whole family circled like a wound we did not want to touch. And it was during those hard years, while I was driving 2 hours each way to sit with my father at his care facility 3 times a week, exhausted and grieving a man who was still alive, that I stopped watching my own marriage as closely as I should have. My father passed away on a Tuesday morning in late winter, quietly in his sleep, and I will not pretend that grief did not blur the months that followed, because it did. The funeral, the reading of the will, the slow bureaucratic grind of estate administration all moved past me like weather I could not control. But even through that fog, I began to notice things that did not fit. Weston, who had barely mentioned the timber company in years except to complain that my board meetings ran late, suddenly wanted to know everything. How the mineral rights were structured, whether the eastern parcels had ever been formally surveyed for the codicil, whether I had read the full will myself, or only the summary our family attorney had provided. And I remember thinking, in the haze of that grief, that his sudden interest was sweet, that he was trying to support me by understanding my burden. When in fact, he was doing reconnaissance. Here is a piece of family history I did not fully appreciate until much later, and you will need it to understand what my husband was digging for that night. My great-grandfather Silas Calloway, during a bitter inheritance dispute in the 1950s between his own 2 sons, had grown so distrustful of lawyers and courthouses that he wrote a private codicil to his will by hand, sealed it in a lead box, and had it buried inside his own casket, with instructions witnessed by the family pastor that the box was to be exhumed and opened only in the presence of the Ting family attorney and at least 2 adult Calloway descendants, a safeguard so that no single heir could quietly destroy or alter the terms of land succession behind the others' backs. It became, over the decades, less a legal necessity than a strange piece of family folklore, the kind of story told at Thanksgiving, and when my father, sensing his own mind slipping in his final lucid years, sat down with our family attorney, Desmond Acaffer, to finalize his own estate, he apparently decided, in a moment of old-fashioned caution that none of us questioned deeply enough at the time, to revive the tradition, sealing a final codicil regarding the disposition and protection of the mineral rights, and a clause restricting any development or sale of the eastern parcels for 20 years, inside a small waterproof case, and having it placed with him in his own casket, with the same instructions his own grandfather had once given, witnessed this time not by a pastor, but by Desmond himself and by my Uncle Roan, who still lived on the property and served as caretaker of both the land and the family cemetery. I did not know any of this the night I found Weston in that grave. I would not learn the full truth until days later. But I want you to sit with the shape of what he was doing, because once you understand it, that image of him standing knee-deep in my father's grave at midnight stops looking like desecration for its own sake, and starts looking like something colder, more deliberate. A man trying to erase the one document standing between him and $40 million. Back at the cemetery, in that first frozen minute, Weston climbed out of the hole with dirt streaked up his forearms and across his shirt, and he walked toward me with his hands raised like he was approaching a spooked animal, saying my name over and over, "Odessa, Odessa, let me explain, it is not what it looks like." And I want to tell you that I screamed at him, that I threw something, that I did something cinematic and satisfying, but the truth is I just stood very still. The way you go still around something dangerous, and I said, "You are standing in my father's grave with a shovel, Weston. Tell me what it looks like instead." He did not have an answer for that, not a real one. He tried a few. He said he had heard there might be vandalism reports and wanted to check it himself in the middle of the night without telling anyone. He said he had been having trouble sleeping and had come out to think, standing near a freshly dug hole at his father-in-law's grave apparently being his idea of quiet reflection, and each excuse was worse than the last. Each one a little performance that assumed I was still the woman who used to let his confidence talk her out of her own eyes. I did not argue with him. I did not give him the fight he was clearly braced for. I simply turned around, walked back to my car in my socks, and drove home, and I want you to understand why. Because it is the same reason I did not scream in that atrium the way another woman might have. Some griefs are too large for noise. They need silence the way a wound needs pressure, and mine needed silence and a telephone. The first call I made, once I was sitting at my own kitchen table with the porch light on and Weston's truck still gone, was to my Uncle Roan, not because he could fix anything legally, but because he was the one other living person who knew what was buried with my father, and because I needed, more than anything in that moment, to know whether the box was still there. Roan answered on the second ring, his voice thick with sleep, and when I told him what I had seen, there was a silence on the line so long I thought the call had dropped. And then he said, very quietly, "Des, he doesn't have any business knowing about that box at all. Your daddy and I were the only two who knew where it sat in that casket, besides Desmond." And that single sentence told me something had already gone wrong long before that night, because if Weston knew enough to dig in that exact spot, someone had told him, or he had found a way to learn it himself. The second call I made was to Desmond Acaffer, our family attorney, a man who had drafted my father's will and countless documents before it, who had known me since I was a girl running barefoot through his office while my father discussed timber contracts. And when I told him what had happened, his voice lost its usual courtroom calm entirely. He said, "Odessa, do not let anyone near that grave again. I am calling the sheriff's office in the morning to have a deputy posted. And I want you in my office at 9 sharp." I did not sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of me, listening for Weston's truck in the driveway, and when he finally came home a little after 2 in the morning, smelling of cemetery dirt and something else underneath it, something floral and unfamiliar that was not my perfume. I did not get up from the table. I simply looked at him and said, "Sleep in the guest room." And for the first time in 11 years, he did not argue with me at all, which told me more than any confession could have. The next morning I drove to Desmond's office before the sun had fully cleared the pines, and I sat across from him while he laid out, calmly and methodically, exactly what my father had done and why. The codicil, the 20-year restriction on developing or selling the eastern parcels, the mineral rights clause that would have prevented any Calloway heir, by marriage or blood, from leasing or selling drilling access without unanimous consent of the family trust, protections my father had built specifically. Desmond admitted gently, because in his final lucid years, he had grown quietly worried about Weston. "Your father came to me 8 months before he passed," Desmond said, folding his hands on the desk. "And he told me, almost word for word, Desmond, I don't trust that boy with what's under our land. I trust Odessa. I do not trust her husband. And he asked me to structure things so that even if something happened to him quickly, even if Weston tried to move fast while you were grieving, there would be a document that could not simply be signed away or forged in a hospital room." I sat with that for a long moment, the knowledge that my father, in his final months of clarity, had looked at the man I loved and seen exactly what it would take me another decade to see myself. And I felt something in my chest crack open, not quite grief, not quite gratitude, something in between, the specific ache of realizing someone protected you from a danger you refused to believe existed. Desmond then told me the part that turned my stomach cold, that 3 weeks earlier, his office had received a call from a paralegal at a probate court 40 miles away, asking routine questions about whether the Calloway estate had been finalized, whether any codicils existed beyond the primary will, questions that, on their own, meant nothing, except that the caller had identified themselves using Desmond's own firm's name without his knowledge or authorization, meaning someone had impersonated his office to probe the probate court for information about exactly the kind of hidden document my father had buried. "Who would even know to ask that specific question?" I said, though some sick part of me already knew the answer. And Desmond looked at me with the particular gentleness of a man about to confirm your worst fear. "Odessa, your Uncle Roan is the only living person besides myself who knew the codicil existed, and Roan tells me the only time he ever discussed it aloud, even in passing, was at your father's funeral reception, on your own back porch, where I understand Weston was pouring drinks most of the evening." I closed my eyes and I could see it perfectly. The reception after the funeral, exhausted family members drifting in and out of the kitchen, Roan, grieving and a little drunk on good bourbon, saying something to another uncle about how Frank went out just like his granddaddy did, taking his secrets to the grave. Literally. A joke, a throwaway line meant for family ears only, except my husband had ears everywhere that night, circulating with a bottle in each hand, playing the gracious son-in-law. And apparently listening far more carefully than any of us realized. That same week, unable to simply sit and wait for the sheriff's office to finish its report, I hired a private investigator, a sharp, unhurried woman named Priya Nair who had a reputation in Savannah for financial forensics, because I needed to know not just what Weston had done at that grave, but why, what he actually needed badly enough to risk digging up a dead man in the dark. Priya worked fast, and within 10 days she brought me a folder that answered the why so completely I almost wished I had never asked. Prute Capital Advisors, it turned out, was not in a rebuilding phase. It was effectively insolvent, carrying nearly $2.3 million in business debt against almost no active revenue. Debt that Weston had personally guaranteed against assets that, on paper, listed our shared home, and more troubling, a projected future stake in Calloway land and timber that he had no legal claim to whatsoever. A stake he had apparently pledged to at least 2 different lenders, as collateral for loans meant to keep his firm limping along. And there was a name that appeared, again and again, threaded through the financial records, a woman named Bianca Reyes, a commercial real estate broker who worked closely with a development company called Sloan Meridian Group, run by a man named Trute Sloan, a developer with a long and public history of buying up rural Georgia timberland and converting it into logistics parks and highway retail, exactly the kind of buyer my father's 20-year restriction clause had been written to stop cold. Priya's records showed hotel charges, dinner receipts, and phone records painting a picture that did not need much interpretation. Weston and Bianca had been involved for at least 14 months, and Bianca, whether out of genuine feeling or naked self-interest, had apparently been the one who introduced Weston to Trute Sloan 18 months ago, at almost exactly the same time my father's health had begun its final decline. The plan, as best Priya and Desmond and I were able to reconstruct it, was almost elegant in its cruelty. Weston needed the eastern parcels and mineral rights freed from restriction so he could quietly broker their sale or lease to Sloan Meridian Group, using Bianca as his contact and taking a finder's fee large enough to erase his debt. And I later learned, fund a fresh start somewhere far from Statesboro with Bianca, once the ink had dried and the money had moved. And the only thing standing between Weston and that payday was a lead box buried 6 feet under Georgia clay, with my father's handwriting inside it. He could not simply wait for probate to reveal the codicil and then contest it in open court, because Desmond had structured the trust so tightly that any contest would trigger a mandatory forensic audit of the entire estate, an audit Weston could not survive given what Priya was already finding. So instead he had decided, in the dead of night, 3 months after burying my father, to dig the codicil up himself, before the court ever formally acknowledged its existence, and simply make it disappear. I sat with that folder open on my kitchen table for a long time, and I want to be honest with you about what I felt, because it was not simply rage. Though rage was certainly there, burning and clean, it was something closer to vertigo. The specific dizziness of realizing that an entire second life had been running alongside my marriage for over a year, invisible to me, while I sat in hospice waiting rooms holding my father's hand. I called Desmond that same evening and told him everything Priya had found, and his voice went very quiet and very careful. The voice of a lawyer who understands he is no longer handling a family estate matter, but something that borders on criminal. Odessa, he said. Attempted destruction or concealment of a testamentary document is a felony in this state. And if what your investigator found about the loans and the collateral pledges is accurate, we may be looking at fraud charges as well. Do you want to protect the family, or do you want to press this as far as it can legally go? I thought about my father, sitting across from Desmond 8 months before his death, quietly building a lead box designed to outlast his own body because he did not trust the man his daughter had married. And I thought about Weston standing in that grave with dirt on his hands, and I said, both, Desmond, I want the family protected, and I want him to understand exactly what he threw away. In the days between that first confrontation and the exhumation, I did something I had never once done in 11 years of marriage. I called a full meeting of the Calloway Land and Timber Family Trust, the same body of aunts, uncles, and cousins who technically held minority voting shares alongside my controlling interest. And I asked them to gather in the very conference room where my father used to review harvest contracts every spring. There were 11 of us around that long oak table, my Uncle Roan at one end, my cousin Delphine Calloway Marsh, who ran the company's forestry compliance office, beside him, a scattering of aunts and second cousins who mostly showed up for the free lunch and the chance to feel important once a year. And for the first time in my life, I stood at the head of that table instead of sitting quietly beside my father while he spoke. I told them everything, plainly, without softening it, the GPS dot in the cemetery, the shovel, the lead box, Bianca Ray's, Sloan Meridian Group, the $2.3 million in debt Weston had tried to secure against land that was never his to pledge. And I watched the color drain out of more than one face at that table, because these were people who had eaten Thanksgiving dinner across from Weston for a decade, who had let him carve the turkey some years, who had trusted the easy laugh the same way I once had. My Aunt Corinne, my father's younger sister, was the first to speak once I finished, and she said something I have carried with me since. Frank always said the land doesn't care how charming you are, it only cares whether you tend it or take from it. And around that table, one by one, the family voted unanimously to formally support the trust's fraud exclusion clause and to authorize Desmond to pursue every available civil and criminal remedy on the estate's behalf. No dissent, no hesitation. Which told me something I had needed to hear for a long time, that I had never actually been as alone in protect ing this land as I had felt during those long months of my father's decline. The exhumation, when it finally happened 3 weeks later, was nothing like what Weston had attempted alone in the dark. It was done properly, with a court order, a licensed funeral director, a sheriff's deputy, Desmond, Roan, and myself all present in the pale gray light of a Thursday morning. And I will tell you honestly that watching my father's casket rise back up out of the earth was one of the hardest things I have ever done, harder in some ways than the funeral itself. Because grief the second time around does not soften, it simply changes shape. Inside, exactly where Roan remembered it being placed, was a small waterproof case, and inside that case was a single sealed envelope in my father's careful, blocky handwriting, addressed simply, "For whoever finally needs this." We did not open it there, at the graveside that felt wrong, obscene even, so we drove, all four of us, back to Desmond's office. And it was there, in a wood-paneled conference room that smelled like old paper and coffee, that Desmond finally broke the seal and read my father's final codicil aloud. It confirmed everything Desmond had already told me: the 20-year restriction on sale or development of the eastern 1,100 acres, the requirement of unanimous family trust consent for any mineral rights lease, and one clause I had not been told about in advance, a clause my father had added, Desmond said, in the very last week before he lost the ability to sign his own name reliably. A clause specifying that in the event any spouse of a Calloway heir was found to have attempted, through fraud, forgery, or physical interference with this codicil or the estate at large, to circumvent these protections, that spouse would be permanently and irrevocably excluded from any claim, present or future, on Calloway Land and Timber Company or its associated assets, regardless of any provision in the marital prenuptial agreement to the contrary. My father, it turned out, had anticipated this exact betrayal so precisely that he had written a legal trapdoor for it before it even happened, and reading those words in Desmond's steady voice, I understood, maybe for the first time fully, the difference between a man who loved you loudly and a man who loved you carefully. My father had never been the kind of man to say, "I love you," more than a handful of times in my whole life. But he had spent his final clear months building a fortress out of paper and lead an old family superstition, specifically shaped to protect me from a danger I had refused to see standing in my own kitchen. I confronted Weston that same night, in the living room of the house we had shared for a decade, and I want to tell you it was dramatic. But by then most of the drama had already burned out of me. I simply sat across from him with the folder from Priya on the coffee table between us, and I said, "I know about Bianca, I know about Sloan Meridian, I know about the $2.3 million, and I know you tried to dig up my father to erase the one thing standing between you and all of it." He did not deny it, not really. He tried, briefly, weakly, the way a man tries to hold water in his hands, and then he simply put his face in those same hands and said, "Odessa, I was drowning. I did not know how else to stop drowning." And I looked at him, this man I had built a decade of Sunday mornings and holiday dinners and small, ordinary tendernesses with, and I said the truest thing I had in me. "You didn't try to stop drowning, Weston. You tried to drag my father's grave down into the water with you." The criminal case moved slowly, the way these things do, but it moved. Weston was charged with attempted concealment of a testamentary instrument, and once Priya's financial forensics were handed over, with 2 counts of loan fraud related to the false collateral pledges against Calloway assets he had no legal claim to, Bianca Reyes was never criminally charged. Though Sloan Meridian Group quietly and abruptly withdrew from any further contact once its name surfaced in a sheriff's department inquiry, developers, I learned, are allergic to publicity involving grave robbery. The divorce, once it finally moved through the courts, was almost anticlimactic by comparison, because between the prenuptial agreement Weston himself had insisted on years earlier, back when he still wanted to appear generous and unconcerned with money, and my father's trapdoor clause excluding any spouse who attempted fraud against the estate, there was simply nothing left to fight over. Weston kept his truck, his clothes, and a mountain of debt with no timber company waiting behind it to bail him out. I did not become CEO of Calloway Land and Timber in some dramatic boardroom coronation. The truth is I already effectively ran it. My father had been training me for that role since I was 16 years old walking the park. Else beside him, what changed was smaller and, in its way, larger. I stopped letting anyone, even the man I loved, stand in front of me and take credit for the ground I had built with my own hands. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I did something my father never got the chance to do himself. I flew to Norway to walk the timber operations of a small sustainable forestry cooperative outside Trondheim that had reached out to Calloway Land and Timber about a possible partnership years earlier. A trip my father had always meant to take and never found the time for. And I went alone, on purpose, with a single carry-on bag and no itinerary beyond the meetings themselves. I remember standing at the edge of a pine forest there, in air so cold and clean it felt like it was scrubbing something out of my lungs, and thinking about how strange it was that the worst night of my life, the night I stood in wet socks watching a shovel bite into my father's grave, had somehow led me here, to a forest on the other side of the world, doing the one thing that had always made me feel most like myself, walking land and asking what it needed. I signed the partnership agreement myself, in my own name, as chief executive of Calloway Land and Timber, a title the trust had voted to give me formally 2 months earlier. Not because anyone doubted I had already been running the company in every way that mattered, but because they wanted my name on the door the same way my father's had been. And I stood in that Norwegian conference room and thought, for the first time in a long while, that I was proud of exactly who I had become. Not despite what happened that February night, but partly because of how I had chosen to answer it. Roan still lives on the property, still tends the family cemetery, and he replanted a small ring of dogwoods around my father's grave that spring, not because the site needed prettying up, he told me, but because dogwoods bloom white in April, right around the anniversary of the exhumation, and he thought my father would have liked the idea of something new and clean blooming over a place that had briefly held so much ugliness in the dark. Amanda from my old life, I mean Bianca, though the names blur sometimes in memory the way betrayals often do, sent me one letter months later, an apology I did not ask for and was not sure I wanted, saying she had not known Weston was married when things started. Only learned the truth later and stayed anyway, because by then Sloan Meridian's deal depended on her staying close to him. And I read that letter once, and I believed the second half of it far more than the first. And I did not write back. Some doors do not need to be answered to be closed. I still think, sometimes, about that first night, standing in the dark in my socks watching my husband dig into my father's grave, and about the strange, terrible clarity of that image. Because for 11 years I had told myself that trust and blindness were the same thing, that not asking hard questions was a kind of love. And it took watching a shovel bite into my own father's resting place to understand that real love, the kind my father had, does not need you to stop looking. It needs you to look so closely that you build protections for the people you love even from 3 feet under the ground. People sometimes ask me whether I regret not seeing it sooner, whether 11 years feels like a wasted decade, and the honest answer is no. Because somewhere in those 11 years, I learned how to run a $40 million timber company, how to sit beside a dying father and hold his hand through a disease that stole his memory but never his instincts about people, and how to stand very still in a dark cemetery and say 2 quiet words, "Weston, stop," instead of screaming. Because I already understood, even before I understood everything else, that the loudest response is not always the strongest one. If this story resonated with you, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Would you have gone straight to the sheriff that first night, or would you have done what I did and let the silence build the case first? And if you enjoy stories about family, betrayal, and the quiet, patient kind of justice that outlasts even the grave, please consider subscribing and joining me for the next story.